So first off, obviously, I must introduce Megan Clancy. She's a first-generation college student and second-year MPP at the Batten School, originally from Portland, Maine. Before pursuing her own higher education, Megan was a pre-K teacher in Richmond, Virginia, where she began attending community college. And on the advice of a political science professor there, Megan applied to the Virginia House of Delegates' clerk's office, where she worked for 2 sessions before transferring to UVA as a third year. She graduated with a BA in politics last May. And during her time at Batten, Megan is interned with the Post-Secondary National Policy Institute and currently works as a graduate research assistant with Ed Policy Works, a joint collaboration between the Batten and Curry School of Education at UVA. Her capstone project focuses on how Virginia's division of school readiness can meet divergent needs of Virginia's youngest learners, depending on if and where they're learning in the past year, in an effort to promote equity-focused educational interventions. And finally, and she didn't say this, but perhaps most excitingly, Megan is a 2021 Presidential Management Fellows finalist and is thrilled to begin working on education and social policy at the federal level in the coming months. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to get out of your way. Megan's going to facilitate questions. You can put them in the Q&A function at any time, and we'll get to them at the latter half of this panel. So thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you to all the attendees for joining us today. I'm especially thankful to our panelists for spending the end of your week with us. I know there are many demands on your time, both personally and professionally, and it really speaks to your dedication to promoting equity in education that you're here with us this afternoon to impart your wisdom through this exciting discussion on how the pandemic has highlighted and exacerbated pre-existing inequities in education and beyond. I've been anticipating today's panel since everyone signed on because I have personally had the pleasure to learn directly from 2 members of today's panel directly in the classroom and secondhand from the other 2 through my previous work and internship experience. So I genuinely cannot express how excited I am that you all get to learn from these experts today and either become familiarized or expand your knowledge on the topic. So let me get through introductions because they all have a lot of expertise, so I will get through everybody. I'm going to start with Dana Lawrence, is the National Deputy Director for Advocacy, Policy Engagement, and Partnerships at Education Reform Now. It's a national think tank and advocacy organization in Washington, D.C. Dana works at the federal level to advance equity-driven policies that better serve K-12 students and was recently named one of Washington Magazine's most influential people in the education category. Dana began her career at DC Public Schools Central Office and was a middle school and high school teacher in both Louisiana and South Carolina public schools. She is an immigrant from Trinidad and Tobago and a first-generation college graduate. Dana earned both her bachelor's and MPP from the University of Virginia. Next is Professor Kimberly Jenkins Robinson. She is a UVA graduate and the Elizabeth D. and Richard A. Merrill Professor of Law at the University of Virginia School of Law, as well as a professor at UVA's School of Education and the Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy at UVA. Professor Robinson attended the University of Virginia for undergrad and continued her education at Harvard Law School, where she served as a member of the Harvard Law Review. She is a national expert who speaks both domestically and internationally about her scholarship, which focuses on law and policy reforms to advance a federal right to education, educational equity, diversity, and civil rights. Previously, she served in the General Counsel's Office at the U.S. Department of Education and as an education litigation associate with Hogan and Hartson. More recently, she published her second edited book, A Federal Right to Education: Fundamental Questions for Our Democracy, which gathers leading constitutional and educational law scholars considering the challenging questions raised by recognizing a federal right to U.S. education, from which I am learning from her currently in her law school class. Delegate Schuyler VanValkenburg is a government and history teacher at Glen Allen High School in Henrico County, just outside of Richmond. He also happens to represent the 72nd District in the Virginia House of Delegates. He was elected to the seat in 2017 on a platform centered around investment in public education and equal and affordable access to healthcare. He attended the University of Richmond and later obtained a master's degree in American history from Virginia Commonwealth University. His life experience invigorates his fight to make Virginia a national leader in education, as he knows how important it is to provide equitable access and opportunity for all Virginians in an effort to ensure a democracy where every voice is heard and counted. He pursues these values in the House of Delegates, where he sits on the Education Committee and chairs the SOL and SOQ subcommittees, where he advocates for increasing state aid to local school divisions to increase the quality of education for all. And finally, our moderator today is Professor Beth Schuler, who is an assistant professor of education and public policy at the University of Virginia and School of Education. She studies education policy, politics, and inequality with a focus on efforts to improve low-performing K-12 schools and districts. Recently, she and two colleagues were awarded a nearly $1 million grant in partnership with the Virginia Department of Education to study the impact of the pandemic on the Commonwealth's public schools over the next 3 years. Prior to joining the faculty at UVA, she was a postdoctoral research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. She holds a doctorate in education policy from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, a master's degree in politics in education from Columbia University's Teachers College, and has taught on politics of education at Brown University, and previously worked on legislative affairs at New York City Council. Most recently, Professor Schuler was awarded the 2021 Thomas A. Downs Award for Best EFP article by the Association for Education, Finance, and Policy. With that, I will turn it over to Professor Schuler.
Thank you so much for the very generous introductions, Meg, and thanks for bringing us all together. Today, I told the other organizers, I had the pleasure of having Meg in one of my classes recently, and she invited me to participate in this panel, and that was the only invitation I needed. So once I saw Meg was involved, I said, yeah, sure, I'm in. So thanks so much for bringing this great group together, Meg, and everyone else who's been involved. So our topic for today, as you all know, because you're here and care about these issues, is achieving equity in education, which is a big topic. And so we're going to try to, I think, narrow it in a couple of ways. But first, I think the topic itself implies the existence, right, of some types of inequities in either educational outcomes or inputs or both. Probably I'm going to guess kind of along some familiar lines of race and social class. And so to begin, I'm hoping that the panelists can kind of help our audience, some of whom work in education spaces, but many of whom do not, just understand kind of big picture, the nature and extent of educational inequality in the US today, with a focus on K-12 schools and school systems. And the elephant in the room here, of course, is COVID-19, and so we'll get to that next and how that may have exacerbated some of those inequalities. But even prior to the pandemic, help us understand kind of on what dimensions, where in the country or where in the state of Virginia, have you seen the largest educational inequalities, and so that we kind of get a sense of the landscape and the extent of the challenges that we're talking about today. Ms. Lawrence, do you want to start us off?
Sure, I'll just be really high level on some of the gaps that we know already existed before COVID-19. Obviously, as you mentioned, there are gaps between students in the K-12 system based on race, where we see numbers in the 20% range for student achievement based off of state annual assessments, and as well as the NAEP exam that shows that white students are performing higher than students of color, Latino students, and African-American students. There are specific gaps between those subgroups as well. English learners have been the subgroup, and that's the term that we use inside the Beltway to talk about different groups of students that's how the data is disaggregated at the federal level. And the English learner category in particular has been extremely, consistently low performing compared to the other subgroups. And so with that, the most recent reauthorization of the Education Act, the ESSA Act, it carved out a specific requirement for states to measure learning of English learning for those students in particular. So we can measure not just looking at their academics and reading and math and science, but also seeing their accessing the education system that we know is fully in English for the most part as well. So I'll kind of start with that and then see what others wanted to jump in, just even from classroom experience or from the law and policy perspective.
Excellent, thanks. Professor Robinson, do you want to chime in here?
Sure, yeah. So first, thanks for having me. Excited to be here. So, you know, Virginia is an example of has opportunity gaps that are similar to much of the nation. So if you look at opportunity gaps across the United States, similar ones exist in Virginia, and they include such things as funding gaps. So for example, Virginia funded schools on average for the state and local funding significantly below the national average. So if you look at a recent report, Making the Grade 2020, it's put out by the Education Law Center. Virginia funded school on average $12,714 per pupil. The national average, though, is $14,548 per pupil. So you can see that that's below sort of where the average even student is. But then an even more troubling number in Virginia is that funding is flat. And so let me explain what that means. That means children who live in concentrated poverty, highs of poverty, research is very consistent that they need more resources for those students to compete on a level playing field with their peers. Virginia, however, has a flat system, meaning that it gives about the same to children who are living in poverty. So on the one hand, people might say, well, that's a fair system because everyone sort of gets something similar. But because we know that the research, there's no disagreement on this. There's a disagreement among education researchers about a whole bunch of stuff, but nobody thinks children in poverty don't need more. And yet Virginia, year after year, in this analysis, its state and local funding is either flat or just mildly regressive, meaning it gets slightly less to children in concentrated poverty. And so that's a longstanding challenge that Virginia really needs to address. In addition, you know, we're home to other sort of equity issues. The school to prison pipeline is alive and well in Virginia. That is a phenomenon in which too often Black and brown children are just disciplined at higher rates than other children. So these are just sort of some of the systemic issues that are happening. And then the larger sort of opportunity gap in Virginia looks at opportunities to take things like AP classes, you know, access to high quality teachers. And, you know, there's definitely significant room for improvement on a variety of measures. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Excellent, thank you. Delegate VanValkenburg.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. And I'll try to bring the energy since we're at the end of the day on Friday. I guess I'll kind of focus on three strands. One is the child. One is the kind of the teacher who provides the kind of direct education, and then one is the broader system. And some of it kind of hits on what's already been said, but I think, like, you know, schools are nothing if not a reflection of our society, right? So the inequalities that are baked into a society are in many ways baked into a school. And, you know, from the child perspective, you know, you look at something like access to early education, which is so fundamental to getting kids on that track, right, of learning how to read, learning how to write, getting those skills that build up to the time I have them, and I teach seniors and 18-year-olds. And I kind of, you know, that's a gap that's, you know, that exists between neighborhoods, right? Different communities within a similar area, but it's also just a gap within communities. You know, my kids have been in pre-K school since 18 months, my youngest since 16 months, right? Learning academic skills and other skills. You know, kids that used to be across the street from me didn't get into school till they were 6. Right? That's a 4.5-year head start that my kids had. And so, you know, access to early education and kind of like consistent education, right? Because people aren't on equal tracks. And so, you know, equal, like as the professor said, right, equal is not always the way you want to think about it. So having those opportunities for year-round schooling or extra, you know, extra work, whatever that is, libraries coming to your home, that type of thing, is fundamentally necessary. And the teaching side, you know, Virginia has the biggest pay gap of like education, right? A teacher with a bachelor's versus someone else with a bachelor's, a teacher's with a master's without a master's. But there's a couple ways you want to think about the teacher inequalities. One is just who we can get and how long they stay and what that does to our teaching profession, right? Another is kind of how we've set up the profession. And then a third is like, who are our teachers, right? And who are teaching children? And we've got a lot of work to do kind of in all of those strands, I think. And then finally, right, I mean, you can't talk about inequality without talking about funding. We have to grow the pie and we have to rejigger the pie. Our funding mechanism is archaic. It is unequal. Richmond City, every time Virginia Commonwealth University buys a building, which it does seemingly every day, it is taking a property out of the tax rolls for the city, which is part of the funding mechanism for schools when you're looking at the state LCI and the state SOQs, standards of quality. So every time VCU buys a building, Richmond City schools are losing money. And because, there is no annexation in Virginia, right? It's a zero-sum game for the city. And so, I'll kind of tease a solution, right? Which is something I think we really need to do, knock on wood, a right majority is back and we are in a place to do this, is we need to look to our neighbors to the north in Maryland with the Kirwan Commission, where they just root and branch, redid how they fund schools, looked at the teaching profession, but we'll get to that later. But I mean, I think you have to look at all these different threads, because in each area, you have inequalities that, of course, when they're combined, create a pretty damning picture. And that's not just Virginia, right? That's the country.
Thanks to all three of you for helping to kind of paint the picture pre-pandemic. Now I want to sort of talk about the present day. So what do you see as kind of the most important ways that the pandemic has exacerbated educational inequalities? And obviously we have limits in terms of what we can measure for, as it relates to student outcomes at this point. But, what do we know about growing inequality, or just, how has the pandemic kind of highlighted, I guess, persistent inequalities that have existed for a long time? Is any of the three of you particularly eager to take this one on?
I guess I'll start since I went last time.
Okay, there you go.
I think there's two things that I've really noticed in the classroom that I think really stand out. And there's a whole bunch. I mean, there's the whole digital divide and all of that stuff. But I think from like just a teaching practitioner standpoint, the two things that have kind of stuck out to me is just how inadequate our support staff system is in Virginia. This is something I've been railing about since I started running for office. We need more counselors, we need more support staff. It was 10 years ago when the General Assembly made cuts to education and the Great Recession, the previous recession. One thing they did is they made a permanent change to the support staff ratio. And COVID is really just bringing home how inadequate our support staff network is. We just don't have enough people, and it's very clear when you have so many kids that you just can't get in touch with and are failing or having mental health problems. The second thing is just the inequalities at home, and when kids are virtual, it's so much harder to teach them and to get them engaged and to get them make sure they're learning. And that's for a whole variety of factors. Parents are at work, parents have weird hours, they've got to take care of their siblings. They're indifferent to school. They don't have the tutor that this other kid has. They don't have them. And that kind of inequality of the haves are having, meaning the kids who are motivated or either internally or externally, or who have the resources to do well, are doing just as well as ever. But a lot of kids don't have that. And so the struggles, and there's been a lot of news about the numbers of Fs in like Fairfax, right? Well, that's happening everywhere. And next year is gonna be a hard year for teachers to get kids ramped back up, both in terms of what they've missed skill-wise, but also we've missed a whole year of like educating, right, in the classroom and getting kids used to doing that again. So those are two things that strike me.
Dana or Kimberly, do you have additional
Yeah, I'll jump in and say, I'll speak a little bit more to the digital divide. That is something that we knew existed pre-pandemic. I think the number was around 20 million students who did not have access to the internet at home. So I would hear lots of members from rural states or rural districts talking about, their students going to McDonald's after school to do homework to get the Wi-Fi from McDonald's, or a really, great partnership with a corporation where they had a Wi-Fi bus that started to come around to their neighborhoods to provide internet that way. And I think midway through the pandemic, that number started to be reduced just out of schools trying to find a way to get learning to their kids virtually, taking it into their own hands to make deals with cable companies and the like. So it went down to about 14 million. And then finally, in this last round of COVID funding from the American Rescue Plan, there was a dedicated funding stream for E-rate, which is the best way groups who are advocating for this, led by the NEA, the National Education Association, they put together a Homework Gap Coalition and have been advocating for many months to try to get this dedicated funding stream in. So now there's $7 billion for E-rate, and hopefully that will lead to under 1 million or even hopefully no students who are missing Wi-Fi at home for homework, but also for learning purposes.
Yeah, so I'll just mention a couple things. So first, you're definitely, they are starting to measure the learning loss, like what kids are missing because of this, first of all, the school closures, and then the switch to remote learning. And so you're seeing the greatest decline actually in math. I think it's partly because as a parent, I can tell you that's one of the harder things to teach rather than reading when you're, and so what the data is showing is that math is where students are struggling the most. But then the other thing you're seeing on top of learning loss, on top of the digital divide that was mentioned, is you're seeing inequities in the opportunities that people are getting to either come back in person. You're seeing those along race and class, and you're seeing that in the quality of online teaching. So for example, synchronous learning, where you're engaging with the students live, is less available to children of color and poor children. They're getting much more asynchronous learning, which of course, as the delegate just mentioned, like getting kids engaged and keeping them focused. Obviously, if you're there with them, you can see what they're doing, or at least, know if they respond if you call on them. Whereas if you're asynchronous, you're not clear if they're on an iPad playing Roblox or if they're really engaging the content. And so, the quality of what's being provided in any of the settings, the three settings of remote, in person, and hybrid are really varying for children along lines of race and class. And so that is further exacerbating the pre-existing opportunity gaps.
All right, thank you all. I want to turn to sort of thinking about barriers, and I'd like to hear from each of you on this one. It's, I'm sure, a challenge because you all sort of know this area in a lot of depth. But if you sort of had to hone in on one kind of biggest barrier for overcoming some of the inequities that have been highlighted so far today, what do you see as the greatest barrier? Like, if you could sort of change one thing, what would that one thing be?
So I'll start here. The one thing that I would change is education federalism. So right now, we appropriately have state and local control of education, and the feds are sort of much more on the sidelines. What I would change is that the federal government is more of a partner with states. They are supporting states and localities doing what they can do, like expanding their capacity with federal support, federal research, federal technical assistance, but also holding them accountable for things like flat funding, things like the opportunity gap. Like there's no one really holding the states accountable, including Virginia. And so because of that, we have these longstanding generational gaps that just endure because the legislature is not changing them. And so because of that, I think we really need a better federal state relationship where there's a lot more federal assistance, support, and I don't just mean money, I mean like expanding state and local capacity to achieve their goals, helping states do what they do best, experimentation, innovation, just expanding their capacity to do that. But I think you also have to have some more accountability. It has to be, not okay that you have an opportunity gap. And instead, there's no accountability for that. And so it just doesn't get addressed in a systemic and sustained way. You get these sort of one-offs where there's tinkering at the margins, but we just have a system that sets up too many poor and minority children to fail. And we keep doing it. And so without somebody holding someone accountable, it's going to persist.
And I'll just say from the federal side, given that I'm an advocate at that level, I could not agree more. 100%, the role of the federal government is, as we see it, is really to protect the students who are most vulnerable. And the Every Student Succeeds Act required disaggregation of data by these specific categories, which was not something, and then that data to be public. And that was not something that was the case for many years, where we couldn't actually drill down and see how are specific students doing at an individual school. We would just see overall how kids are doing in a lot of places. And so now there's transparency, and there's the ability for the public, for policymakers, parents, to be able to look at the data and access it and ask questions and, get more engaged, whether it's at the school board level or the PTA or in a more organized fashion. And other pieces are barriers. I thought about resources. I think that's another huge role that the federal government has to play, but it has to be with provisions like maintenance of effort, maintenance of equity, that basically say you can't shortchange your state budget because you're getting an influx of federal funds, but it has to be supplemental. And that way, the kids who, as folks have said already, you do need more resources to serve students in poverty, and you need to layer it on to the funds that are already being provided. Capacity was another thing I was thinking about, and that's exactly what the Department of Ed should be. Obviously, over the past 4 years, we have had a department that was not looking out for the best interest of students. Lots of positions were cut, and there's a lot of rebuilding that, quite frankly, is being done right now. There's lots more staff positions that need to be filled at Ed. And when we talk to folks over there, they're just like, we're really busy and we're breathing through a fire hose, or we're drinking out of a fire hose. And, it's going to take time to be able to even build capacity at the department. But hopefully, once that's there, they'll be able to then be that resource and provide that technical assistance that states really need. Yeah.
So the biggest obstacle is democracy. And, I don't mean that in like an overly negative way. I just mean it in a like literal democracy's hard way. And, it makes it really hard to make big change. And it makes it very easy for small changes to accumulate into a mess. And so, one reason why I really like the idea of what Maryland did, and I would like to see us do it here, and I'm going to be pushing for us to do it here very strongly in the next 6 months, is because if you just don't go all in and rip out the guts and start fresh with new eyes and build a coalition to do it, you're never going to do it. When you're thinking about how you fund schools, or you think about changing the teaching profession to provide more options for teachers to move up the ranks, or differentiate what they do, or all these different things, and tied to that kind of democracy, the second barrier is education fads, which swing like this. A great example of that right now is standardized testing. I mean, it is insane how the pendulum has changed on standardized testing in the last 5 years. I think it's mostly a good change, don't get me wrong. But we've gone from this world in which we had a very highly routinized, centralized, standardized testing regime that I would argue wasn't good. It wasn't effective. It was shortchanged in resources. It was really bad tests. It was creating this kind of, teaching for the test became this negative thing. Teaching for the test is only negative if it's a bad test, right? And then it's swinging the other way to this kind of completely decentralized local model, which was why we swung to the centralized model in the first place. And then that gets caught up in the democratic back and forth. And so I think the two biggest obstacles are democracy and education fads, because it just really gets in the way of sustained long-term thinking with some level of consistency. And I'll give you an example. I did something that's probably wildly unpopular in this room and among a lot of people. I refused to vote for taking the Virginia SOLs down to the federal minimum. And it's not because I don't want to take them to the federal minimum. It's because what are we replacing them with? If we're just replacing them with performance-based tests that are made at the local level, graded at the local level, and the Virginia DOE is just like, that's off of our table, we're right back to where we were pre-George Bush, Teddy Kennedy, and No Child Left Behind. I think the answer, as both people just noted before, is some kind of like centralized accountability, right, with localized kind of wiggle room in there, but we never seem to get there. And so, like, once we go to the federal minimum as a state, there's literally nobody with any leverage to ensure that there's accountability for that, because the DOE won't have it anymore. The General Assembly will be like, we did what the people wanted. And we're back to where we started. So, yeah, that's I think the challenge.
Yeah, I think if I had to answer this question, I'll ask myself the question. And I think my answer is related to a number of the things that you all have already said, but in some ways, I think at a very basic level, inequality in political influence, to me, ends up being kind of the greatest barrier, right? Because it makes it very difficult for those who are on the losing end of these inequities to really kind of advocate for change effectively, which is related to these issues of democracy, of sort of centralization and its role in trying to be progressive and sort of compensate for inequities at the local level. All right, I want to move before too long to a kind of Q&A to make sure we have time to answer questions from the audience. But before I do that, for good reason, we focused largely on some of the intractable challenges and kind of barriers to equity. But I'm hoping you all can also give us some hope. So are there kind of promising proof points of whether it be, communities or kind of reform efforts, judicial victories, legislative change, where, the decision makers kind of got things right, and, and instances that could sort of be a model for inspiration moving forward, or in Virginia or other communities around the US?
Yes. So, the last 2 years in particular, I think Virginia's done a lot of good things. I don't pretend to think that we're perfect by any stretch, but I'll give a couple bullet points. One, we are rooting through our curriculum to make it more equitable. It started 2 years ago with the Governor's Task Force on African American History, and is now continuing with a commission whose name I can never remember because it's really long, but it's about bringing in more groups and more classes, and I'm on it, and it's I'm on the curriculum subcommittee, and I think we're going to do good things there too. The prison to school pipeline, we, I think, have done a pretty good job of getting that conversation, of unrolling that, whether it was school resource officer reform, it was ending disorderly conduct charges in schools, it was creating a memorandum of understanding between localities and police departments if they do have police in school, starting to collect data on it. We're making strides in that space. In the funding space, we're making strides. We're getting more counselors in schools. We are raising the at-risk add-on fund. We are talking about, at the state level with the statewide candidates, we're talking about real reform of education, which excites me. I want that to be the top issue. I think it should be the next top issue we tackle. And so I think there's a lot of reasons to be encouraged. It's not enough yet. We have a lot more to do. We need people to push and prod and vote based on those things, because otherwise it'll go away. But Yeah, I think in Virginia we are on the right track on a lot of these issues, especially as they relate to equity and education. And so, long may it continue, I guess.
Dana, do you want to take this one?
Sure. Yes, I think we've all learned a lot from COVID, policymakers, lawmakers, educators, even kids and parents, right? And I think it's taught parents a little bit about maybe their students' learning styles. Some have excelled. I've talked to a handful, I should say, not many, but a handful of my colleagues whose students are just thriving in this virtual setting. And then I think schools and districts are now better prepared to get out resources to kids in case of an emergency, whether it's a snow day, it's going to impact them on one day. That those learning, every day of learning, as we know as educators, matters, and to be able to not miss a beat and still, have access to learning, and really even we saw schools rise to the occasion very quickly when it came to getting lunches out to kids. So I think just a lot of the logistics and planning that has gone into this past year will be hopefully very much useful coming up. And then that $150 billion that is coming out of the American Rescue Plan should be another helpful influx of much needed resources for schools and districts. And there's a ton of flexibility in how those funds can be used. Some of us in the equity space were really excited to see that there are set-asides for learning loss. I think it's 20% must be spent by the states on addressing learning loss as a result of COVID, and 5% at the local level. Some of that will also go directly to summer enrichment opportunities. So I know, for teachers to be able to get their kids back engaged in learning, just being in person and being around their friends again will be helpful, but having extracurricular activities in the summer and camps and music and sports and all of the other things that we know, get kids engaged and motivated to learn will be funded. So I think, just having this more nimble system post-pandemic, we'll see maybe what the outcomes are. And I would love to hear, if that's something that as an educator in the classroom now that you feel like delegate is going to come, are you going to be able to see those dollars, or do you feel like, it'll be made over the heads of educators and, it might just turn into another fad. So we don't want that.
It's a good question. We'll see, right? I don't know.
Professor Robinson, do you have some hope for us?
Yeah, so it's funny, I was going to talk about the American Rescue Plan, but Dana covered that really thoroughly. So I do think there's a lot of room for opportunity there. And I think what's important about the plan is that, because schools closed and everyone realized how dependent we were on schools, now people are like, oh, wait a minute, we really need these schools. And I think the insights parents have into sort of how challenging it is to teach their kids all of that, I think all of that will go to the, will help to support schools seeking to bounce back from this moment. So I think there's some opportunities there. I'd say the other thing that's promising that has happened sort of in the last 40 or so years has been, we've learned a lot from school funding litigation across the country. So there's been a robust set of cases across the states where, plaintiffs have said, you either aren't providing an equitable education or an adequate education. And there's quite a bit we've learned from that litigation. Litigation is definitely not the best way to go about achieving the goal of equity and advancing equity for all kids. But we have learned a lot of things. So for example, the fact that many state legislatures used to, and some still do, basically decide the amount of education funding as a budgetary residual rather than costing out what it costs to educate kids and then funding that. So things like that, lessons like that have come out of the litigation, sort of the need to tailor funding toward what you actually want kids to learn, which sounds really obvious, but that wasn't happening for in a lot of states. And so we're seeing some moves in states where that's been successful to say, no, if you pass these state standards, then you need to cost out what it takes to teach kids to those standards. And then you need to, you need to fund that. And so that's been a really, I mean, it sounds really basic, but that's been a really important move in the states to really require legislators to fund what they say they're going to do. And so there are some positive things happening in the space as a result of that. So that's just sort of one example of some good things that are happening.
I can make a quick comment on that too. I think that really speaks as well to the importance of having a simplified system for how the state forecasts how it's going, what it requires to constitutionally fund education. You know, if you go into the Virginia SOQs, it's incredibly complex. The average person can't understand it. And, you know, in 2009, the legislature went in and just snipped a little bit of the ratio for what a constitutionally mandated education is for support staff. And that little snip was, over the course of 10 years, over $1 billion in lost state money to localities for support staff positions. And because it's so complicated and it makes no sense, and probably half the state legislature doesn't even understand the SOQs and the LCI, it makes it very easy for the state to juke the stats, as they would say in the wire, right? And so, like, it's really important that you have a simple system of here's how we're spending and here's what it's for. And it's something I think is important for people to advocate for.
Yeah, the other thing I'll add from the sort of researcher perspective is that, you know, another benefit I see of the kind of school finance litigation has been the kind of emergence of higher quality evidence around this question of, does money matter for schools and how much? And I think there was for a long time kind of a debate that, you know, where that was a question, right? Where there was sort of disagreement among scholars about the extent to which money mattered. And I think in recent years, we've seen really high quality social science evidence emerge from the sort of slow rollout of these cases over time that really kind of, in many ways, puts to rest that debate, and it makes it very difficult to kind of to argue that money doesn't matter. All right, at this point, I'm going to hand things back over to Meg, who's going to facilitate our Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. I feel my brain getting bigger as each of you speak. And so, Professor Schueler, I'm going to bring you into the fold here when I pose these next set of questions, since we have a researcher, legislator, litigator, and advocate on the panel. So in your view, what is the ideal role of research, litigation, advocacy, and legislation in addressing these educational inequalities? I've often found that kind of everyone's kind of siloed doing their own work. Is there a way for us to collaborate across these fields in an effort to really capitalize on this moment? And Professor Robinson, I'll start with you.
So litigation, you know, should only be undertaken when necessary, but unfortunately, it's often necessary. So, you know, as I was talking about accountability before, you know, you have to unfortunately hold states accountable for doing what's right for kids. And, you know, sometimes legislatures will roll up their sleeve and say, hey, we're going to re-examine the formula, or we're going to you know, look at these issues because we have a lot of inequities and inadequacies in the state. And other times they will allow the formula to just languish on when it's outdated and needs reform. And so litigation, when necessary, is a powerful tool. It can really lead to, you know, the research is definitely clear that you can often get funding increases from that. Unfortunately, though, you know, it's always going to take the legislature to overhaul the system. Like the court can't rewrite this, is, you know, reconfigure the funding formula or decide the SOQs. Like it's always going to be the legislature. And so ultimately litigation is just kind of a tool to really get the legislature to act. And even in Virginia, you know, they rejected the school funding litigation that happened. They rejected claims about equity in Virginia. So that was an ineffective tool. But in the places where it has sort of moved forward, you do often see, you know, some reform that's happening. I think there's more that can be needed. So it's kind of a necessary evil a little bit, because it's very expensive and it's very labor intensive, and it goes on for a really long time. But unfortunately, you have to be able to press lawmakers to do the right things for kids. And sometimes to press them, you have to take them to court to make it happen. So.
Well, as the legislator, Delegate VanValkenburg, where do you see your role stepping in terms of addressing inequities?
Yeah, I mean, look, it is the legislature, right? The legislature passes laws. Like at the end of the day, if you want to make society more equitable, or you want to achieve a certain goal, the legislature is clearly the best route to do it. I mean, but you got to make the legislature do it, right? I mean, Medicaid expansion is a great example in Virginia of you can want something all day, and if the legislature is a certain amount of people who don't agree with it and they're in a majority, you're not getting it, right? Advocates can go to the General Assembly every year and ask for it. The governor can rail on about how we need to do it. You know, people can try to sue and take it into the courts and it doesn't work, right? And then in 2017, right, not just because people wanted Medicaid expansion, obviously there was a whole bunch of other things that had happened, including a November 2016 election, but right, like you get a different majority, and then the years of advocacy on Medicaid expansion made that the #1 issue, and it got done. And so I really think you need to have a friendly legislature, but you also need to have a friendly legislature who's prioritizing your issue. Because if you don't have that, you're still not going to get it done in the way you want to get it done. And I mean, that is where you have to have everybody firing in kind of one way, right? Advocates, interest groups. You know, if you look at Massachusetts in the 90s, who kind of did the 90s version of what Maryland is doing now, you had like this whole concerted effort. You had chambers of commerce, you had big Republican officials, big Democrat officials, you had a whole bunch of different sectors of society saying, we got to do something, right? And they got it done. And so, you know, it's kind of one of those things where I don't know, some of it I think is just seeing the glaring inequities and people engaging around it, and then getting enough, you know, you do need elected officials who care about it, so you got to get the right people to run. And I'd like to say there's some silver bullet, but I think some of it's luck, some of it's the moment, some of it's like a ton of sweat equity. And I think the moment's right for it, not just here, but across the country. I think for the last 10 years, you've seen a huge increase in support for public education and for teachers for a variety of reasons, mostly because of states that were dramatically underfunding education, right? I think COVID has, to the professor's point, right, I mean, totally changed how people view education, right? And the lens in which they view it. I seriously hope nobody is going to go out there now and argue for virtual charter schools after this year. I hope, or better, I hope no one takes them seriously. You know, so I do think the moment's right, but it does require a lot of those things. And now I'm rambling, so I'm going to stop.
No, thank you so much. One thing that we learn in the politics of public policy at the Batten School is waiting for the right moment and a form of agenda setting. So Dana, I think that's a good segue to you. How do you motivate legislators to care, to move on these issues?
It depends on the legislator and the issue. I used to advocate at the state level in South Carolina, and I can tell you it was a very interesting approach that was needed, because half of the legislature was just not interested in looking at data and what the numbers had to say and making excuses for things. And then the other half wanted just to protect the status quo and, protect the educators, and felt like any sort of negative information about student achievement was a result of teachers and teachers alone, and a sort of a statement on that. And they felt very aligned politically to that. At the federal level, I think I can speak more specifically about, I'll just talk about, where we are now. We have new leadership on the Senate Education Committee with Chairwoman Patty Murray, now that Democrats have control of the Senate. And Bobby Scott is the chairman from Virginia in the House on the Education Committee. And what's helpful is when they're aligned on an issue, it makes the way that they're enlisting advocates as well as listening to advocates interesting. So I've been in the role about 4 years, and in the beginning it was a lot of us having an issue that we wanted to get them to listen to and support. as you have been able to build relationships and get really trusted, credible partnerships with other institutions who already are extremely sort of well respected. We're a very tiny group, but when you partner with civil rights community, when you partner with a disability community, those are voices that are very powerful. And then you can do a lot with being helpful to members as well. So there's been disagreements among Democrats on the issue of standardized testing, for example. We have a couple of, well, one new teacher in particular, who is now a member on the Ed and Labor Committee, who's very anti-testing. And that is not aligned with Chairman Scott's position, where he views assessments and the data coming out from assessments as a civil rights issue. And it's something that was very much hard fought battle, back when ESSA was being reauthorized by, the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights, the Unidos US, National Urban League. And it took a long time to get to the point where we are now. And so having really using advocates as your messengers and saying, here are the folks that we need to talk to and to get the word out, and really being enlisted by elected officials to spread truths about equity and what types of policies they're looking to change has been an interesting sort of turn of events. I'm always wondering, like, where do you make the most impact, on the inside or on the outside? And now it's a little bit of both. I'm on the outside, but I'm, helping out the inside too. But I think, going back to your initial point about the relationship between research and advocates and policymakers and everything like that, you only have a policy that's as good as the implementation of it, right? So you can have this really solid evidence-based research, data-driven, plan, and then if it's implemented and folks aren't buying in because they feel like it's just something else that's being thrown at them or being asked of them, it's going to be a lot harder to get the outcomes that policy could have achieved. And so having stakeholders like educators and parents at the table when decisions are being made is, I think, always a smart thing. And finally, folks, in our space and the advocacy community are figuring that out and really, enlisting, creating a table and getting stakeholder input. And I think with the new administration and Secretary Cardona, he's talked a lot about doing that. He's already held a summit on education, on school reopenings. He's talked a lot about getting student voices in the decision-making at the federal level as well. So yeah, there's a lot of role. I mean, without advocates, I think we can be a pain sometimes, but at the end of the day, who you're advocating for matters. Oh yeah, I have one more point, I'm remembering it now. So the way that, some of the impact can matter the most is based on influence, right? So I know lawmakers also view they need to be in office to be able to govern, right? You have to win to be able to govern, and you have to keep your seat if you want to stick around. And so sometimes that balance definitely is something, that they have to walk very carefully. And I think the reason that teachers as in unions really, they have been so powerful over the years is their ability to position themselves as a voting bloc, right? And they're not just members of an organization, they also have a PAC, right? That is a very well-funded, well-resourced entity. And so getting an endorsement from the NEA or the AFT is a really powerful tool that elected officials are going to want to seek if they're on the Democratic side, at least. And so I think figuring out ways to get students who maybe are under 18, their voices to matter as much, and for lawmakers to be able to listen in a very realistic way is something that we could work on. And same with parents. Parents have opinions too, and they're not viewed as this, no one's going out to get the parent endorsement, right? When they're running for some things, and but that matters too. So just something to think about.
Thank you so much. Well, Professor Schueler, I want to give you the last word here. As I mentioned in your intro, you and some of your colleagues were just granted a huge award to be researching the impact the pandemic, particularly on K through 12 schools. So when, you guys are approaching your research, are you thinking about the ways in which, you need to appeal to legislators and advocates, or is it something where you guys are just, and I'll incorporate like one of the questions in the chat too, like why is it so challenging to study these educational interventions that could address some of the inequities in the system, and how does that shape the work that you do?
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. So in the case of this particular project, I should start more generally. I think one reason it's difficult to study these issues is just that at a kind of fundamental level, it in some ways requires kind of admitting, policymakers, advocates, kind of admitting that we don't know 100% kind of what works, right? And so, that's kind of the need to learn and to use evidence, which is a hard thing to do. And so, I think a lot of it has to do, in terms of moving forward, has to do with kind of building competencies related to kind of consuming evidence among the constituents that are sort of holding electeds accountable. I'm sure also us researchers could be better at communicating our findings, although the incentives to do that are not always well aligned. Universities don't always necessarily prioritize or reward that work. So there's work to be done on that dimension too. When it comes to the Virginia project, we're very lucky in the sense that, so the Virginia Department of Education is actually the prime grantee on the grant. So we're doing this work really in partnership directly with the Virginia Department of Ed. And so and so we have a number of topics that we're hoping to look at, both in terms of kind of to what extent does kind of variation in the ways that divisions reopened explain differences in student outcomes, with a particular focus on equity, so kind of growth in gaps on a number of both kind of inputs and outcomes, as well as sort of teacher outcomes. So to what extent were kind of kids and teachers moving around, how did these reopening plans affect kind of teacher retention and the like. And so, I think our partnership and, the kind of leadership that the VDOE is taking to work with us on this project is really, I'm hoping, going to be really helpful, because, we work together to develop the research questions. And so the goal of that kind of partnership, right, is you hope that if the partner is helping to craft the questions, that they are going to ask questions they really care about, hearing, they're going to care about hearing the answers, right? And so I think it's a nice model for this type of work in order to kind of try to maximize impact, which is all of our goals, right?
Well, thank you so much. I, at the end of a long week, I'm sure, spending a Friday talking about something that I know is important to all of us and giving us a little bit of hope. So I will hand it back over to Jeff.
Yeah, gosh, I have nothing of substance to add after this amount of brain power has passed my screen the past couple hours. So all I'll say is VPR is very thankful for all of you joining us as guests. As Megan noted, it's 5 p.m. on Friday. So I'll just leave with, if you want to stay engaged with us, you can find us at virginiapolicyreview.org or Virginia Policy Review on social media. Have a wonderful Friday evening. Have a safe weekend. Thank you all.